In this set of lecture videos, I'm going to be talking about civil liberties. After this lecture is over, you'll be able to explain the difference between civil rights and civil liberties. And it's not always crystal clear, but you'll see the difference. You'll be able to explain the concept of selective incorporation. Now, I hate that phrase, but it's actually very descriptive. But it's complicated, so I'll try and break it down for you. You'll be able to give an example of a limitation on the federal government that was ultimately applied to the state governments, and that is in fact what selective incorporation is. You'll explain when the courts have permitted the government to limit individual freedoms, and in that I'll introduce a concept called compelling interest. You'll hear that phrase over and over again just as a sort of heads up. A compelling interest just means an important reason, and that'll make more sense as we talk about it later on. You'll be able to explain the difference between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause in the First Amendment. And you'll be able to explain whether the courts have made it harder or easier to limit freedom of speech. So with that in mind, when we talk about civil rights, we're talking about the idea of equality of rights for all people regardless of their race, gender, ethnicity, age, sexual preference or orientation, anything like that. And so examples of this would be that there's supposed to be equality in terms of access to voting, access to housing, access to employment, and that it's not people are not supposed to be discriminated against on any one of those categories. But civil liberties are a little bit different. When we talk about civil liberties, the thing I want you to keep in your mind is the idea of limitations placed on the government. Limitations placed on the government. And this is why there's a gray area between civil liberties and civil rights, especially in regards to voting, right? But we'll come back to that in the next lecture. Essentially, when we talk about people's civil liberties, we're talking about the idea that the Constitution protects citizens' inalienable rights, their natural rights. Now, this goes back to the very first set of lecture videos where we talked about in natural rights. And if you recall, the idea of natural rights is the idea that there are certain rights that people have by virtue of being human beings. The way the framers thought about it, these are rights given to people by God by virtue of them being human beings. Now, we already know that the framers are very selective in the way they thought about this, right? Because when they talked about rights given to human beings, by virtue of them being human beings, there was slavery, right? And certainly women didn't have rights that men did, and property owners didn't have rights. So it's complicated, but that's the basic idea, is that there are certain rights granted to people by virtue of them being human beings. And so I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about. The First Amendment essentially codifies, in a way, some of these rights. So what it says in the First Amendment, I'm going to read it to you directly as it is in the First Amendment, and then I will translate it into English. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Obviously, that makes no sense, so let me translate. The very first part, Congress shall make no law, and I want you to keep that in mind. I put that, it's bolded and italicized for a reason. Congress shall make no law. What it says is Congress cannot pass laws favoring one religion over another. That's what they mean by respecting an establishment of religion. The government, the federal government, cannot favor one religion over another. The federal government, Congress, cannot prevent individuals from practicing their religion. And that's what they mean by, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. When they talk about abridging freedom of speech, Congress cannot limit an individual's right to speak freely. When when it talks about freedom of the press. It cannot limit what the press writes, and especially about the government, because that's the thing that they were particularly concerned about. And that last sentence, the right for people peaceably to assemble, the government can't prevent people from peacefully gathering or joining groups, right? I mean, you can't join a group that's going to be a terrorist group or trying to overthrow the government, but if people are gathering peacefully, the government is not supposed to limit that. And the last part, and to petition the government for redress of grievances, the Congress cannot prevent individuals from asking the government to correct something if they feel they've been wronged in some kind of way. This is all in the First Amendment. But the point that I'm trying to make in talking about this right now is that it begins by saying Congress shall make no law. Congress refers to the federal government, right? The House of Representatives and the United States Senate. So the key point is that I'm trying to make at this point is that when the Constitution and then later the Bill of Rights, because the First Amendment was part of the Bill of Rights, not the Constitution, when the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were first ratified, they only placed limitations on the federal government. Now, as we talked about, there are certain things explicitly that limit state governments. But outside of that, the limitations that are placed, for example, in the First Amendment apply to the federal government. Congress shall make no law favoring one religion over another, preventing individuals from practicing their religion, and so on. But the Constitution and the Bill of Rights now places limits on the federal government and state governments. Even though it says Congress shall make no law and lists everything that Congress can't do, it might as well read now, today in 2022, Congress and state legislatures may not. Well, that is the process of selective incorporation, where it isn't the case that the courts have said in one big decision, by the way, hey everybody, every limitation placed on the federal government also limits state governments. That's not the way it worked. What the courts have done, because they're the ones involved in this process of selective incorporation, is they've done it right by right, liberty by liberty, one at a time. They've gradually applied, stated in different court cases, hey, this limitation on the federal government, by the way, this applies to state governments. State governments are limited in the same way, right? It might just have to do with freedom of speech, the first thing we're going to talk about in the next video. But that doesn't necessarily apply to other things like freedom of religion. Then in a separate case, the courts might do that. And so we'll talk about this process of selective incorporation, how they have selectively said, by the way, this also limits state governments. Oh yes, and this also limits state governments. So selective incorporation is the process by which the courts have decided that some of the limitations on the federal government also limit state governments. Right? Again, in the original version of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, in this case, when we're talking about the First Amendment, it only limited Congress. But as I said, today, the First Amendment limits Congress and the state governments. Although it doesn't appear anywhere in the First Amendment, that's how it is. That's through the process of selective incorporation, the process by which the courts, the federal courts, for the most part, have decided that some of the limitations on the federal government also limit state governments. And so the question is, what caused that change? Because that's a huge change. That's a big change. That's what I'm going to explain in the next video.